How's everybody doing? Doing good? Doing good? So last keynote of the day, right? There are two more sections of talks after this. Pitch is at 5:15, pitch contest. I'm not sure exactly if there's spots open left for that or not. If there are, feel free to go look at the front. But right now, we are really excited to have Jake Soanes here with us. And Jake has 18 years of experience. Does that sound good? Industry experience, and that time split between Sony Online Entertainment, Insomniac Games, and Blizzard. So in 2014, you founded Shovelware Games, and that's a studio focused on developing small scope titles and providing game design consultation. So really excited to hear from Jake right now. So, all right.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. So I wanted to talk about designing with randomness and how you can use randomness to make your game more interesting. And I titled the talk, All I Do Is Win, mostly because I love the song, but also because I feel like in a lot of cases, it's something that the designer can do to make the player feel like they're having more fun by kind of skewing the odds in their favor. And so I'm going to go through a bunch of examples of that. But first, I kind of wanted to talk about how I got to where I am. Seeing as there's a lot of students here and people who were like trying to break into the industry, I thought I'd tell the story of how I did that. So like George mentioned, I've been doing this a while. I started out as an EverQuest game master back in 1999. Which is, that's an entry-level position that was pretty much just customer service. It's like you're playing EQ and your sword disappears, so you write a game master and be like, hey, help me out here. So I did that for about 2 years, and then I was going to college at the time, studying computer science. And as I talked to more people, I realized I didn't really want to be a programmer, I wanted to be a designer. And so I started talking to the designers at the company and asking them like how they got to where they're at. And at the time, there wasn't really any design education. It was kind of, almost all of them had on-the-job training through an apprenticeship program, which I got in on. And it was pretty cool because it was a lot of like kind of random tasks at first. Like the first thing I did was I got this huge spreadsheet of trash loot that was in EverQuest. And I had to name all of the trash drops. So like every time you kill a skeleton, he drops something like that you go bring to the vendor and sell. And so I'm looking at a list of like 75 bone chips, and I've got to come up with names for 75 bone chips. So I'm on like thesaurus.com every day being like shattered bone chips, decimated bone chips, burned bone chips, just like coming up with all these different things. And it's kind of interesting to like get a peek behind the curtain. You're like, oh yeah, somebody's got to do that. Like that's somebody's job. So that was one of the first things I did while I was an apprentice. In addition to that, there was some of the more senior designers that actually held classes where myself and the other apprentices attended, and we talked about like how to design games. And I'll get into one of the lessons that I learned a little bit later on. But then as an associate game designer at Sony Online, I worked on the PlayStation 2 version of EverQuest, the expansion to that. And then I worked on Champions of Norath and the sequel to that, which were kind of like a DIABLO clone on PlayStation. A little bit of the personal side of that, those games were developed by Snowblind up in Seattle. I was living down in San Diego at the time where Sony Online was, who was publishing the game. And they were shorthanded, and they asked Sony Online, hey, do you have anybody who could come up and help us finish the game? So I was like, yeah, I'll do that. That sounds like fun. So I flew up to Seattle, and I ended up living out of a hotel for 6 months, and I pretty much just was at the office and the hotel. While I was there, I did two things other than work. I went to a Mariners game, and I saw the Space Needle, and that was it. Like, I was just working the rest of the time. A year later, they wanted to do a sequel. They were still shorthanded. They're like, hey, you want to come back? And I was like, yeah, under one condition. I get to live in an apartment instead of a hotel. So I got a furnished apartment. And also that time I drove my own car up there, so I had a lot more freedom. The first time I was there, I was too young to rent a car. So the producer that was up there with me rented a car, and all he wanted to do was work. So that's all I did. So after those games wrapped up, that was the last PlayStation game that Sony Online published. And I was really loving working on consoles as opposed to PC, which is everything else they did. So I put in an application for a UI designer at Insomniac in Burbank, that's right outside LA. And honestly, I didn't really have a lot of UI experience. And at this time, it was 2002, there weren't UI designers. That wasn't like a specific position. So I had some web design experience that I'd done in my free time, and they had a test where they asked you to redesign their lobby for Ratchet and Clank 3. And so I was taking photos of my screen, and I'm photoshopping in here's what I would change, and this is what I would do. And that was what I did to get that job there. And once I got in, I started doing UI, but also some other game design tasks. I got to design some mini games. We did a PlayStation 3 launch title called Resistance, and then after that we did the Ratchet and Clank on PS3. And at the time, Sony was really hype on their new controller because it had this tilt technology. And so they asked the designers to pitch some concepts of what you could do to use the tilt controller. So I proposed a mini game called the Decryptor, which had been in previous Ratchet and Clank games. And in this one, I wanted to use the controller to tilt a board that kind of worked like a wooden labyrinth game when you're a kid, with a marble moving around the board. So the board was like a circuit design, and you had to move this metal ball around to help a spark travel along a circuit. And it was pretty much just like that labyrinth game. But it was fun that they let me do things other than straight UI design. And from there, I kind of branched out and later on started doing some proper level design on some of the other Ratchet and Clank games. So I was there for 5 years, and I shipped 6 titles in that time. And that's 6 AAA titles, which is a lot of work. And the way that Insomniac worked at the time was they had 2 teams going all the time. They had one pre-production team and one team working on the game in production. And so as soon as everybody finished a game on production, they immediately rolled off into the next game as it moved from pre-production to production. So it was a lot of crunch. Actually, Nathan's here in the audience. We both worked at Insomniac together, and he's familiar with how much work that was. It's probably a good reason why he lives in Indiana now. Right, so I was there for 5 years, and we were talking yesterday. I don't know how many people were here. I'd give a much shorter version of this story, but I think interacting with people that you work with and making friends with people is one of the most important things you can do in this industry. What happened after Insomniac is a couple of my friends that worked there went down to Blizzard, and they started working on World of Warcraft. And after they'd done that for a while, they're like, Jake, come on down. We got something for you to do. So I took a job at Blizzard as a game designer, and I got to work on one of my favorite games of all time. As a kid, I kind of skipped ahead there. As a kid, I used to play Diablo like crazy. My brother and I had drilled a hole in the wall between our rooms, and we ran a LAN cable through it so we could play Diablo together. And that was in my cover letter when I applied for the job. I was like, "You guys don't get it. I love this game. It means so much to me."
My parents are so mad. But it was working.
Yeah, exactly. Well, luckily that wall wasn't a full wall. It was just a plywood wall. Anyway, so that kind of ended in. So the reality of game design is that layoffs happen, and sometimes you get caught up in them, and it's not a lot of fun. So after I got laid off from Blizzard, some friends back at Sony Online were like, "Come on back, we got this crazy new project that we're working on. You'd be perfect for it." So I took a position as a lead designer on this bright, shiny new title. So I learned how to use these transitions, and they're super fun. On Landmark. Well, it started off as EverQuest Next, and it kind of splintered off. And this game was supposed to be kind of like a Minecraft killer. It was about making and building things in 3D, and not just using the blocks of Minecraft, but we had this crazy voxel smoothing technology where we were making rounded corners and stuff. And so my task there with the UI experience that I got at Insomniac was mostly UI focused, but not UI in the sense that here's a bunch of windows that need to be laid out. It was how to interact with the world and bringing that interaction into 3D space. And it became a lot of teaching concepts of 3D modeling to people who had never thought about 3D before. So that was a really fun challenge, and I really liked my time there. But after a while, the project started going in different directions, and I didn't feel like it was really what it seemed like it was going to be at first. So I set out on my own, and I started a company called Shovelware Games. This was in November of 2014, and I've been doing this since then. And as Shovelware Games, I've been doing design consulting and making small scope games like George mentioned. As a consultant, I've been really lucky, again, through the people that I know and through the people that I worked with and the people that I met. They've approached me and asked me to help them out with stuff. So I was at the PlayStation studio in San Diego. I was helping them out with their UI and their user experience for all of their non-MLB titles that are developed there, which there's one game that came out called Kill Strain. Did not do very well. It was canned shortly after. I got on that project a little too late to help them as much as I wanted to. And then there were a couple other games in the pipe that seemed exciting, but Sony decided to shut down that part of San Diego studio, and now they're just doing the MLB titles again. After that contract ended, a friend of mine, Corey Davis at Psionics, we were talking together about what he wanted to have the studio focus on after Rocket League. So they had like piles and piles and piles of money from Rocket League, and they're like, we should make something else. And they're in a really awesome position in that they're not under any pressure to like ship something immediately. So they had a lot of time to prototype and try different stuff. And I was there with them for almost a year, helping them out with trying different directions and doing a lot of rapid prototyping and just pie in the sky design ideas. And that was super fun as well. It's actually one of the few things that I can't talk about because they haven't announced anything, but it was super fun. In addition to that, I made a couple of mobile games. Zombie Match Defense came out 2 years ago, and it was my first attempt at a mobile game, and I learned a lot of what not to do when making a mobile game. I had fun making it. I became a much better developer because I did pretty much everything on my own aside from the art and the sound. So I learned how to program a game from the ground up, well, using Unity from the ground up, as opposed to just doing gameplay scripting, which is mostly what I was doing before that. And then I'm wrapping up a game right now called Squealings, which is a puzzle game about spreading happiness. And it's super cute. And if you find me later, I'll show you a demo on my phone. There was somebody that I promised to show that to yesterday that I never met up with. There you go. I was like, well, I was going to show him the game. And then I got distracted. All right, cool. So that's the history of me. We're all caught up, and I've shaved 10 minutes off my presentation. So I wanted to do like a quick game design crash course, talking about like one specific area of game design. And that is, in my opinion, the most important rule of game design. You guys ready for this? It's going to shock you. It's so out there, so wild. Make sure the player's having fun. I don't just mean like make sure your game is fun. I mean like check in. Make sure the player's always having fun. There's always something going on. There's always something to do. There's always like something to lead them on to the next thing. And I cheated a little bit. I stole some of my slides from other presentations. At the end, I will have links to all those presentations. This one I just straight up screen grabbed, so apologies. But this is a really great talk that Naughty Dog gave. It's about narrative design. That's not really what I'm talking about today. But the lesson, I think, applies to a lot of other things. So they have this chart in the talk. They're talking about how over the entire lifetime of the game, there's all these little arcs. There's all these moments where like your excitement level kind of peaks and then fades and then peaks and then fades. And I kind of tried to define some of those moments. So I think at the base level, those like moment-to-moment things I'm trying to conceive of as like, that's the excitement. That's like, I shot a dude and he exploded. I made a match in a match 3 game and like something fun happened. So that's like the lowest level. And so this gets into how you approach a problem. And this is the bottom-up way of designing a game, where you start at the second-to-second design and figure out what people are doing in that time, and then you build on top of that into the overarching thing. And so that's kind of what this thing is talking about. So you take those clusters of excitement and you build on top of that. And when you've like chained a couple of these like exciting moments together, I think that's where the fun is. When you've like done something cool and you do something cool again, you're like, all right, I'm having a good time. Like this is fun. And so you want to try and string a bunch of those moments together. And then on top of that, when you've had a couple of those, you've played the game for a while, you know, you're ready to like turn in for the night. I think that session is something that I think is akin to like generating interest. That's what's going to make you come back to the game. Whether it's like a free-to-play game that you got on your phone, you're not really invested in it, or whether it's like a $60 title that you're like, I paid for this, I'm going to play the whole damn thing. But like, I think it's important for you to have that feeling after you're done that you want to come back and play it again. And then they talk about the story arc being the entire thing overall. I think when you're done playing the game, you're left with this overall feeling that's like an accumulation of all of these things. I highly suggest watching this talk. It has nothing to do with what I just talked about. It has everything to do with narrative moments, but I think like the concept of building is applicable here. So all of these things together are the concept of pacing, and I think that's what people like in games. It's why you keep playing the game, because it's well paced. So I want to talk about applying that pacing to Diablo 3. I said before I stole a slide from another presentation. This is the last time I'm going to steal slides from a presentation, but I totally did. This is a presentation that my buddy Ed Haynes at Blizzard put on. And the main reason that I was looking for this presentation was because I wanted to show you guys the tool set that they use to make the dungeons in Diablo. But while I was watching the presentation, they also had this list of design goals that I think dovetails really nicely into what we were just talking about with pacing. It's talking about how frequently exciting things happen. So they kind of break it down into different types of change and different types of things that occur. But they're saying like every 20 seconds, you need to have something that you can interact with. Every 5 minutes, you need a chest to open up that gives you something. It's probably not something exciting, but it's, you know, it's the chance. It's like that pull on the slot machine. And then every 10 to 15 minutes, you get a resplendent chest, which is the chest that has a higher chance of having cooler stuff in it. And then on top of that, you have bosses, and on top of that, we're talking about switching up the environment that you're in or what it is that you're doing every 15 minutes. And so this is what I was looking for in that presentation. This is the DRLG tool that stands for Dungeon Random Level Generator, I think. It's in here later. We just called them Durgles because it's fun to pronounce words without vowels. So on the left side of the screen here, you can see the part that you can interact with, and that's branching logic that talks about how different sections of the level connect to each other. And the thing I wanted to get at was how long you go in between the start and the stop. If you look at the left-hand side of the screen there, there's a red box near the top that says Add Exit, and at the bottom there's a green box that says Add Entrance. And it runs through all of these rules top to bottom, and the order that it shows them in is kind of their order of importance, but every one of these rules needs to be executed, with the exception of there's a question diamond in there that says Select, and that just means like pick one of these things from this list below. And on the right side of the screen, you can see one instance of how this dungeon could be generated. And so there's all kinds of tools to talk about making sure that your dungeon is completable every time with every roll. And if you're interested in this, again, there's a link to Ed's talk at the end of this that you should definitely check out. He goes way more in depth in all kinds of stuff. But I wanted to talk about how the dungeons actually work. And this is a concept called Wang tiles, named after Hao Wang, who is a mathematician who came up with this concept of putting these tiles together. And the way that Wang tiles work is they're visualized here by color, but they can really be anything. The idea is each tile can only border something that has an edge that matches up with it, which is how the Diablo rooms work, is that each room is a tile that has an exit on either side. And so when you roll the level, you're taking these two tiles that have exits on sides that touch each other, and you can mash them together, and then that's a valid connection for you to make. And so this is what it looks like when you take a bunch of Wang tiles and put them together. You'll see that you won't see any triangles anywhere. You'll only see like the diamond shape or larger patterns. And that just means that everything lines up seamlessly. And so these are what dungeon tiles essentially look like in Diablo. We use the naming convention of which side the exit is on. So across the top, that's a tile with a south exit, then a southeast, then a north-south, northeast. You get the point. So when you take all these tiles and you put them together, on the right side, you can see like what a dungeon layout would look like after using that tool from a previous slide. This is what the actual tile looks like using game assets. On the left is just the tile as it appears in game, and on the right is the tile with its nav mesh attached to it. And kind of a behind the scenes, the way that nav mesh works in Diablo is that despite the fact that it's a 3D game, the nav mesh is 2D. You'll never see an instance of like a bridge going over a path or anything like a balcony going over something underneath it. Every time that you do see that, there's something that's some kind of trickery that fools you into thinking that you're on top of something else, but you're not actually. The nav mesh is a plane that just has height maps on it. And so we go through and we color them to say what you can do on each cell of the nav mesh. And so in this example, the green is where you can walk, the blue is where you can't, and then the red, you can kind of see a red outline in some of them. That's the tile that like stops the projectile. So if you like shoot a missile into that building, you can't really see it because the building's on top of the nav mesh, but you can see them peeking out in a couple places. That's what stops the projectile from going through the building. And so here's what it looks like when you take all of those tiles together. This one didn't have the nav mesh on it, so I kind of drew it over. But you can kind of see in the upper right, you can see what the layout looks like. And in the rest of the picture, you can kind of notice some familiar patterns, like the tile that the cursor is over, number 16, and the two to the right, number 13, are actually the same tile. You don't really notice because there's a lot of decoration that's randomized inside there, and so things feel differently. Also, there's a different density of mobs, so you might encounter something different while you're going through that tile. So we came up with a bunch of rules when doing your level layout that help with the pacing. A big one, probably the biggest in my opinion, is backtracking sucks. Like if you're walking for like 5 minutes and then you get to a dead end, you're like, well, crap, I got to go back through all those rooms that I just cleared, and there's nothing for me to do there. I'm just walking, and that's not fun. So you want to try to keep to shorter branches. On top of that, if you have like kind of a donut shape and you branch off of the donut shape, it's much easier to get back on path where you don't feel like you've gone too far down a one-way street. On that trip, like if you do go down like a path and you find nothing at the end, that also is not exciting at all. So we decided that if you're going to go further than like 2 tiles off of the main path, we should give you like a chest or the big monster to fight or something to do there. Another point to mention is that the player doesn't know what the main path is. They're exploring this like a maze. They don't know what the start and finish is. So we don't want them to go super far thinking they're headed towards the exit, and then they get to the end and they're like, well, that's not the exit. Now what do I do? So that's another reason that the donut shape helps, because you could leave and then come back and try out different paths and never spend a lot of time not making progress. Tile size is also really important. If you have like a lot of things to do inside of a tile, when you start putting those tiles together, the stuff gets really big really quickly. And so it starts to take a long time to get through. I think the level we learned this on was the spider caves in Diablo 3. I don't know if you guys remember. Yeah, it's really long. It takes a while to get through there. Yeah, and we, with the later, that was one of the first levels to be done. And so with the later levels, we learned that lesson and applied it. The other thing is when you reach the exit, it doesn't necessarily need to be like a staircase to another level. The exit can be just a teleport back to the front of the level, as long as there's something to keep you moving and you don't have to run all the way back through that entire level. So that was a bunch of ways to use randomness for level layout and how pacing applies to that. But outside of pacing, there's a lot of opportunity to use random chance to adjust the player experience. There was a tweet that went out in August of last year by Jennifer Shirley about asking people, like, what are the behind-the-scenes tips that you, or not tips, but behind-the-scenes mechanics that go on in a bunch of games. And she got a huge response to this. You can see there's 3,000 retweets and 782 tweets in this thread. She ended up turning all of these into a talk, which again is linked at the end of the thing here. I didn't steal any slides from her, mostly because they were all video, and I was like, dang, that's a lot of work. I can't steal that. So one of the things that she brought up was a bunch of stuff that goes on in BioShock. And there's a bunch of really, really cool things happening here. In BioShock, the first time an enemy shoots at you, he will always miss 100% of the time. And so that's a time where I feel like you have this random chance for this thing to occur, and as a designer, you're kind of putting your thumb on the scale and being like, that's not how it works right now. Right now, instead of having a 30% chance to hit me, you have a 0% chance to hit me. And then from there, you can branch off. But the idea here, or the motivation here, comes from a couple of different standpoints. One, it's tough to guarantee that the player is looking at what's shooting them. So if your back's to the bad guy and he shoots at you and you have no idea that he's there, if you see a shot fly past you, you're like, oh crap, that came from that way. I got to turn around and deal with it. In addition to that, it's intended to help players who are a little less skilled at the game, because you want them to have a good time too, especially in BioShock, where the game isn't really about like 360 no-scope sniping. The game's mostly like, this is a crazy story and you're in the middle of it, and you want everybody to be able to experience that, and having a barrier to that makes the game less approachable. Another tricky thing they do is that anything that would kill you actually leaves you at 1%. So if your health is greater than 1%, it'll only go down to 1%. If your health is below 1%, then you can die. So if you get sniped from across the map and it was a critical hit or whatever, instead of just dropping you dead, it gives you a chance to like feel like, oh shit, that was a close call. I gotta figure out what to do here, find some cover, do something. And it leads to a lot of exciting moments. And that's another point where I feel like the designer had a really strong hand in making that adjustment and making that choice. The last tip from BioShock is that when the players drop their loot, instead of just looking at a table of things that they could drop, they look at the inventory of the player and they see what they have and they see what the player needs. And they'll drop, or they won't specifically drop, but they'll increase the odds of dropping something that you need depending on how badly you need it. So if you need it really, really bad, there's a higher chance that they'll give that to you. If you're like mostly full on ammo or mostly full on health, there's a smaller chance that they'll give it to you. Oh, I kind of did that. Yeah, so that works for ammo and health, but enemies also drop cash because there are vending machines in BioShock where you can spend the cash. So if you're like low on a specific type of ammo that you need and you haven't had it drop in a while, you can go to that vending machine and spend that cash that dropped from that dude. And that kind of gave the player a little bit more agency and letting them decide what it is that they wanted to do and how they wanted to spend their cash. Okay, so ignoring Scott Adams' political affiliations and craziness, this is actually a pretty good comic about randomness. And it's really, it's not uncommon to have streaks in your randomness. And a classic example is flipping a coin. You flip a coin, there's a 50-50 chance it's going to land heads or tails. You flip it again, you still have that 50-50 chance of it landing heads or tails. That number doesn't change. So you could flip a coin 100 times in a row, and in theory, it's possible for it to land tails every single time. Like, those odds adjust, but every individual flip is still a 50-50 chance. And Sid Meier, who's an industry luminary, made Civilization most famously, had a great talk about how that concept applies to people's emotions, and about how emotions tend to overrule logic. You know every time you flip a coin, there's the same chance, 50-50, but it feels bad if you like lose a 50-50 bet a bunch of times in a row. So in his talk, Psychology of Game Design, which there's a link for at the end of the slide, he talks about how he's made adjustments to that in Civilization and to try and prevent streaking, despite the fact that it's still presented as a 50-50 chance, consecutive losses actually on the back end adjust the chances. So it's no longer a 50-50 chance. You have a higher chance of victory. He doesn't go into the specifics of what that threshold is or how quickly he ramps that up, but it's definitely something to do there. And he states that suspension of disbelief goes out the window when you feel like the game is cheating you. So when you feel like the game is cheating you, you don't think about the fact that you have a marauding horde that's running through Europe and taking everything over. You're like, no, this game is cheating. Like the computer is messing with me right now, and it takes you out of the experience. And so when you make these concessions where you start messing with the numbers, it's not just so the player has a better time. It's not just so they feel like they're winning. It's to keep them immersed in the experience. It's to keep them feeling like this is an actual thing that's happening. So another thing that he noticed specifically, which I thought was really helpful, is people don't like losing a fight where they're heavily favored. And he defines heavily favored as somewhere between 3-to-1 odds and 4-to-1 odds. So when you look at something and you have like a 75% chance to win, you feel like it's almost always going to win. And that combined with the adjustments of the percentage chances on the back end leads you to a more kind of victorious circumstance, which is the idea behind the talk, All I Do Is Win, because we want you to win. We want you to have a good time. We don't want you to feel like the game's too easy, but we don't want you to feel like the computer's cheating you. You don't want you to feel like the random number generator is working against you. Yeah, that's kind of the point I was just talking about. So that applies to a bunch of different things. The concept of consecutive events having different random chances. Like when you play JRPG and you're running around on the overworld map and you get stuck in a random battle, it sucks to finish a random battle, walk one step, and get pulled back into another random battle. Like that messes with your pacing like crazy. So the earlier JRPGs did do this, and it did not feel good. But the later ones, they started putting a cooldown. So as soon as you finish a fight, there's no longer like a 50% chance that you're going to get another fight. There's like a 1% chance. And then every step you take, it kind of builds back up to whatever that normal threshold is. So that helps with not just the pacing, but also just the frustration where you feel like you can't make any progress at all. And that gets into loot boxes, because we can't talk about random chances without talking about loot boxes. Hearthstone actually does all kinds of stuff that you might not be aware of that is actually really beneficial to you as a player. So last year, China passed a law that all loot boxes need to state their odds. And this is a screenshot of the Hearthstone website in Chinese that I used Google Translate to translate. And it states, if you've played Hearthstone, you get a pack of cards, you open it, it has 5 cards in it. One of those cards is guaranteed to be of rare quality or better. So there will always be a rare or a higher quality card. What they state here that wasn't previously known is that the odds of you getting an epic card are 1 in 5 packs, and the odds of you getting a legendary card are 1 in 20 packs. But the really interesting part, in my opinion, and what ties it into the cooldowns and adjusting the scale, is what it says at the bottom there. This is a quote from Google Translate, so it's not a direct quote, but it says, "In addition, it should be noted that as the number of card packs is increased, the probability that the player actually obtains high-quality cards will increase simultaneously," meaning that your odds actually change as you go past that average of 1 in 20. And on Reddit, some folks did a whole bunch of experimenting, and they found that this is the distribution curve for legendary Hearthstone cards. The average is 1 in 20. And then as you get past 30, your odds go up and up and up. And by the time you have opened 40 packs of cards, you are guaranteed to get a legendary card. And this is this is awesome. This is keeping you from flipping that coin 100 times in a row and getting tails every time. This is like making you feel like you're not getting cheated. In the worst case scenario, you're getting it twice and twice as long as they intended the average to be. So there's a site called pitytracker.com. Sorry. They called this concept a pity timer, like the game's taking pity on you. It's like, you've suffered enough, here's a legendary. So there's this site, pitytracker.com, where you can keep track of all of the packs that you've opened. It'll let you know, like, in 5 packs, you'll get a legendary, guaranteed. Like, keep at it, man. And I think that's super cool. And this is like completely community driven. This is not Blizzard. This is just people who are hyped on the game. When you enter in a pack, you can put in like how you got the pack. That doesn't have any influence on the odds at all. I think that's just for their like analytics and just looking at like how often people spend money versus how often people are like getting the reward from playing the game. So additionally, they do a couple other things. One, if you own a legendary, when you get a legendary out of a pack, it will never be a legendary that you already own. They will see that that's about to happen, and they'll be like, no, we'll give you that one, and a different random legendary will show up. I don't know how it works if you own every legendary in the game. I don't think you should be opening packs at that point, honestly. Just save your money. In each pack, you can't get 5 of the same card. You can only get as many cards as you could use in a deck. In Hearthstone, that's 2. So you'll never open a pack and have more than 2 of the same card. This one's also super cool. If you have started opening packs from a new expansion, you are guaranteed to get a legendary within the first 10 packs, which is 4 times more likely than you normally are. So instead of guaranteeing at 40, it guarantees at 10, which, again, all I do is win. Like, I'm having a good time. Everybody's making sure you're doing cool stuff. All right, so this is a brief interlude about psychology. Game design has a lot to do with psychology. A lot of it is talking about the player experience and what they're thinking and what they're feeling as they play through the game. And this is what I'm going to talk about is one of the first things I learned when I was doing my game design apprenticeship, and it blew my mind freaking wide open. And I was like, yeah, I want to tackle this. I want to think about these problems. And that is the Skinner box. This is an experiment that was a famous experiment from the 1960s where this guy, B.F. Skinner, put a rat in a box with a lever that gave it food. And every time the rat hit the lever, the food would come out. This is a process called operant conditioning. And when the rat learns this, when the rat knows when I push the bar, I get a food, they start messing with the rat and they start doing all kinds of stuff. And they tried all different kinds of conditioning and all different types of reward tables. So instead of like, I press the lever once, I get a food, it's I press the lever 3 times and I get a food. I press the lever every 20 seconds, I get a food. And through messing with these rules, they kind of discovered that the variable ratio, which means I press the lever somewhere between 1 and 15 times I get a food, is the most addictive quality. It's the easiest to learn and the hardest to forget. So the rat very quickly learned, I just keep mashing this and randomly I'll get a thing. And because the idea of the next one I do could be my food, like they just kept doing it. And they did not stop doing this when they turned it off. Like if they just kept the lever going, the rat would just continually do it because he's like, I've pressed it 5,000 times, but the food might come on 5,001. I don't know. On top of that, they tried it with all kinds of different animals. And I just learned this last night when I was doing some additional research, that a lot of other behaviors started occurring with this experiment. Birds started showing superstitious behavior, where they were like, if I turn to the left and then I hit it, that I think would make the food come out. So they started like turning to the left every time and hitting it, and like every 15th time they were right. So they started to believe that's how it worked. So if you're more interested in psychology and about how it applies to loot boxes and gambling, here's a bunch of vocabulary for stuff. I like how everybody hit that at the same time. That was perfect. There was an urban legend that he experimented on his kids and that he put them in boxes and like that's how he fed them was by using the levers and stuff. That stemmed from a photo that was in Life magazine of this crib that he built to keep his daughter warm. So most of the stuff that I talk about, that I've spoken about so far has been either about single-player games or things that don't really affect the balance of a multiplayer game. And I want to take a quick moment to talk about the balance of multiplayer games. I think it's really important to know what kind of game you're making when you start adding in randomness that affects game balance. Mario Party is a great example of a game that you're trying to reach the widest audience possible. You're trying to get everybody playing together. You're trying to get them all to have a good time. So it has a lot of randomness, like randomness that can drastically swing the way the game works. If you're not familiar with Mario Party, it's essentially a board game, kind of like Chutes and Ladders. You move your character around, you roll a random die, you land on a space, something happens. Sometimes that's you get a coin, sometimes you lose a coin, sometimes it's, more often than not, it's a mini game. And in mini games, all the players play together, and whoever wins the mini game gets a larger reward. So at the end of the game, after you've gone through all these things, the win condition is whoever has the most stars. And you can get a few stars by doing stuff throughout the game, but at the end of the game, they give out stars for random stuff. It's like, this guy landed on the most blue spaces, he gets a star. This guy lost the most times, he gets a star. I don't think that last one actually is a thing, but they have a lot of things that like are unpredictable as to what they'll give you the awards for. I mean, it's a finite list, but it chooses from that list randomly. And so I can't tell you how many times I've been super pissed off because I've been kicking ass the whole game and just slaying everybody at the mini games. And at the end of the game, somebody who's been doing kind of terribly just gets a random star and ends up beating me. And I'm like, pfft. But that person had a good time playing. They were like, I'm almost there. And you know, they had a good experience. You can't do that with a competitive game, though. You can't do that with you know, a game that's entirely skill-based. So be wary of that when making skill-based games. That's not to say that you can't have game balance randomness in skill-based games. Fortnite is a great example because when you're playing Fortnite, what you get out of each loot crate or what you get out of lying on the ground or however you pick up items is random and it is unbalancing. But this randomness happens at the start of the game, and it kind of, as the game progresses, the chances that you have gotten all the things that you need are higher and higher. So there's not a last-minute swing where you feel cheated. If you like run into a game and you happen to land next to some dude who just picked up a shotgun, and you get blasted in the face and you die, yeah, that sucks. But like you didn't invest 15 minutes into that scenario, and at that point you can just quit and start another game. If you watch the kill feed in the lower left, there's somebody who got a rifle who's just like tearing people up. And this is like the first 5 minutes of the game because they lucked out. You know, they landed at a place where A, they got the rifle, and B, there was enough people for them to shoot at that they're actually doing a pretty good job of it. All right, so that is the end of my prepared statements. Now on to random topics. Whatever you guys want to talk about, I would love to talk about. If you don't want to talk to me right now, you can talk to me on the internet. I'm on Twitter, at my name, at Jake Sones. This is a character from Squealings. He's super happy. I am also available for design consultations for talks like this. And if anybody has a game that they don't know how to make and they want it made and they want to give somebody money to do it, you let me know and I will help you out or I'll point you in the right direction. Yeah, so Q&A, y'all. This is all of the talks that I was talking about. I would highly suggest taking a photo of this. Note, these URLs are case sensitive. I did not realize that when I used that URL shortener, and I apologize.